I never believed that love could bloom in the darkest corners of human experience until I met Li Ming in a refugee shelter in Istanbul. His eyes hollow with trauma, but still burning with an unextinguishable flame of hope. My name is Marcus Chen, and though my surname connects me to Chinese heritage, I was born and raised in San Francisco, a third-generation American who had never truly understood what it meant to fight for the basic right to exist. That understanding would come through falling in love with a man whose courage had carried him across continents, away from everything he had ever known, in search of something I had always taken for granted: the freedom to love without fear. I was 31 years old and working as an investigative journalist for a major American newspaper when I received the assignment that would change my life forever. Our foreign correspondent had fallen ill, and I was asked to cover a story about the increasing number of Chinese refugees arriving in Turkey, many of them fleeing what the Chinese government called vocational education and training centers, but which human rights organizations recognized as detention camps designed to eliminate cultural, religious, and personal identities that didn't align with state ideology. The story was important but felt routine, another chapter in the ongoing documentation of authoritarian overreach that I had been covering for years. I had reported on political persecution in dozens of countries, always maintaining the professional distance that allowed me to do my job effectively without becoming emotionally involved in the human stories behind the headlines. That professional detachment had served me well throughout my career, partly because it matched my personal approach to relationships. I had always been career-focused, avoiding romantic entanglement that might complicate my work or compromise my objectivity. I had dated casually but had never allowed anyone to get close enough to threaten the carefully constructed barriers I maintained around my emotional life. Looking back now, I can see that my commitment to professional objectivity was really a form of emotional cowardice. It was easier to observe other people's courage from a safe distance than to confront the parts of my own life where I had been settling for safety over authenticity. The flight to Istanbul gave me time to review the background materials on Chinese detention facilities. The reports were harrowing systematic attempts to erase ethnic, religious, and cultural identity through a combination of indoctrination, forced labor, and psychological torture. But it was the testimonies from individual survivors that stayed with me during the long flight, personal accounts of people who had lost everything but had somehow maintained enough hope to risk escape. Istanbul was overwhelming in its complexity, a city where East met West in ways that created constant cultural tension and synthesis. I had been there before on assignment, but this time I was struck by how many people seemed to be in transit, carrying the invisible weight of displacement and uncertainty that marked them as refugees even when they tried to blend into the local population. My first week was spent meeting with humanitarian organizations, Turkish officials, and established refugee communities. The Turkish government's position on Chinese refugees was complicated, officially supportive but practically constrained by diplomatic and economic relationships with China that made open criticism difficult. It was Dr. Hasan Özkan, a Turkish psychiatrist who worked with trauma survivors, who first mentioned Li Ming to me. We were sitting in his small office near a refugee service center, discussing the psychological challenges faced by people who had survived systematic persecution. "There is one young man," Dr. Özkan said carefully, "who arrived 3 months ago in particularly severe condition: malnutrition, untreated injuries, symptoms consistent with prolonged psychological torture. But what makes him remarkable is his resilience. Despite everything he has endured, he has been helping other refugees, sharing his language skills, providing emotional support to people who are struggling even more than he is. Would he be willing to speak with me?" I asked. Dr. Özkan's expression grew cautious. "Perhaps, but you must understand, this man has every reason to distrust strangers, especially those who might expose his location or identity. If I arrange a meeting, it will be on his terms, with protections in place for his safety." I assured him that my intention was to tell the broader story of Chinese persecution while protecting individual privacy, but privately I was already feeling drawn to this Li Ming, whose combination of suffering and compassion had captured the psychiatrist's respect. The meeting was arranged for the following week at a small community center in one of Istanbul's older neighborhoods. Dr. Özkan would be present as both translator and advocate, and Li Ming reserved the right to end the conversation at any time. When I walked into the small meeting room, I saw a young man sitting with his back to the wall, positioned so he could observe both the entrance and a secondary exit. Even from across the room, I could see the hypervigilance in his posture, the careful way he held himself that spoke of someone accustomed to danger. But when he looked up at me, I felt something shift in my chest that I wasn't prepared for. Li Ming was probably in his late 20s, with delicate features and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. He was thin, almost fragile-looking, but there was something in his bearing that suggested an inner strength that hadn't been broken despite everything he had endured. Li Ming, Dr. Oskin said in Mandarin. This is Marcus Chen, the American journalist I told you about. Li Ming studied me for a long moment, and I could feel him evaluating not just my words but something deeper: my intentions, my character, whether I was someone who could be trusted with the story that had nearly cost him his life. You are Chinese, he said finally in careful English, noting my surname and perhaps recognizing something in my features. Chinese American, I clarified. Third generation. My great-grandfather came to San Francisco in the 1920s. Something flickered in his eyes at this information, though I couldn't tell if it was interest, disappointment, or something else entirely. So you have never lived in China, he said. It wasn't a question. No, I haven't. I've reported on Chinese issues from the outside, but I've never experienced life there personally. He nodded thoughtfully. Then you do not understand what it means to breathe carefully, to calculate every word, to live always with the knowledge that who you are might be enough to destroy not just your life but the lives of everyone you love. The simple statement carried such weight that I found myself struggling to respond. He was right. Despite my Chinese heritage and my years of covering human rights issues, I had no personal experience with systematic oppression. I had grown up with freedoms that I had never had to fight for, had never had to hide fundamental aspects of my identity to survive. You're right, I said finally. I don't understand that experience personally, but I'd like to learn, if you're willing to teach me. Over the next 2 hours, Li Ming told me his story with a quiet precision that was both heartbreaking and profoundly moving. He had been a graduate student at Beijing University, studying comparative literature, when he was arrested on charges of spreading harmful foreign ideologies and engaging in activities that threatened social stability. His real crime, he explained, had been participating in underground discussion groups where young intellectuals shared literature and ideas that the government considered dangerous. But there had been another dimension to his persecution that he revealed only gradually, testing my reaction as he shared more personal details. In China, there are certain kinds of people who are not allowed to exist, he said carefully. The government says we are products of Western decadence, that we threaten the traditional family structure, that we must be cured or eliminated. He was talking about sexual orientation, though he hadn't said it directly. I could see him watching my face, evaluating how I would respond to this most dangerous part of his story. How long were you detained? I asked, keeping my voice steady and professional even as I felt a deep personal connection to his struggle with identity and authenticity. 22 months, he said. 22 months of what they called re-education. 22 months of being told every day that who I am is a sickness, a corruption, something that must be eliminated for the good of society. The systematic nature of the psychological torture he described was devastating. Daily sessions of forced self-criticism, group denunciation sessions where prisoners were required to attack each other's incorrect thinking, manual labor combined with constant ideological instruction, and medical procedures that were presented as treatment for mental illness but were actually forms of aversion therapy designed to change sexual orientation. The physical conditions were terrible, Li Ming continued, but the psychological warfare was worse. They were very skilled at making us doubt our own perceptions, our own worth, our own right to exist. After months of being told that you are fundamentally flawed, part of you begins to believe it. But it was the personal details that affected me most deeply. The way he described lying awake at night in the dormitory, planning his eventual escape by memorizing guard rotations and facility layouts. The moment when he realized that survival meant not just enduring the physical hardships but protecting some essential part of himself that they were trying to destroy. I knew that if I stayed much longer, they would succeed in convincing me that who I am is wrong, he said. So I chose to risk death rather than lose myself completely. His escape had been planned over months, timed to coincide with a prisoner transport that would take him closer to the western border. He had managed to slip away during a rest stop, then had spent weeks hiding in rural areas, stealing food and avoiding the massive manhunt that followed his disappearance. "How did you make it to Turkey?" I asked. "Underground network," he said simply. "Other people who understand what it means to run from persecution. Uyghurs, Kazakhs, dissidents, people whose religion or politics or sexuality made them enemies of the state. We help each other because no one else can." When our interview ended, I felt emotionally drained but also energized by the power of his story. This was exactly the kind of reporting I had dedicated my career to, giving voice to people whose experiences needed to be heard, documenting injustices that thrived in darkness. But as I walked back to my hotel that evening, I realized that something had changed during our conversation. My professional interest in the story was becoming complicated by a personal fascination with Li Ming himself, his quiet strength, his refusal to be broken by experiences that would have destroyed most people, the way he spoke about identity and authenticity with a clarity that challenged my own comfortable assumptions about freedom and courage. I spent the next few days writing and revising my article, crafting Li Ming's story in a way that would protect his identity while conveying the full horror of what he had endured and the courage it had taken to escape. But I found myself distracted, thinking about our conversation, wondering about his life in Istanbul, whether he felt safe, whether he was healing from his trauma. When I sent Dr. Oskin the draft article for Li Ming's approval, he called me back within hours. "He would like to meet with you again," Dr. Oskin said. "He has some corrections to make, and he wants to discuss the implications of publication." We arranged to meet at the same community center, but this time the atmosphere felt different. Li Ming seemed more relaxed, less guarded, though still maintaining the careful awareness that had become second nature during his months of hiding. "The article is good," he said after we had gone through his corrections. "You understand the important parts of the story, even though you have not lived it yourself." "Thank you. I hope it helps draw attention to what's happening in those facilities." "Perhaps," he said. "But Marcus, I have been thinking about what you said during our first meeting, about wanting to learn from experiences you have not personally had." I waited for him to continue. "There are others like me in Istanbul. People who escaped, people who are still healing, still trying to figure out how to build lives after losing everything. Your article tells my story, but it does not tell their stories. Would they be willing to speak with me? Some might be. If they trust you, if they believe you will tell their stories with the same care you showed mine." Over the following weeks, Li Ming became my guide into Istanbul's hidden community of Chinese refugees. He introduced me to other survivors, men and women who had fled for various reasons but who shared the common experience of losing everything in pursuit of the basic right to exist authentically. Each interview was emotionally devastating and professionally invaluable. But I found myself looking forward most to the time I spent with Li Ming between interviews, the quiet conversations we had over meals or while walking through Istanbul's historic neighborhoods. He was teaching me Mandarin phrases, and I was helping him improve his English. We talked about literature, politics, our families, our dreams for the future. It was during one of these conversations, about 6 weeks after our first meeting, that I began to understand that my feelings for Li Ming had evolved far beyond professional respect or even friendship. I was falling in love with him, with his intelligence, his resilience, his quiet humor that emerged as he felt safer and more comfortable in my presence. The realization terrified me. I had spent my entire adult life avoiding romantic complications that might interfere with my work. I had convinced myself that my dedication to journalism required emotional distance, that caring too much about the people in my stories would compromise my objectivity. But sitting with Li Ming in a small cafe in Sultanahmet, watching him smile at something I had said in badly pronounced Mandarin, I understood that my carefully constructed emotional walls were crumbling. This man, who had survived systematic persecution designed to erase his identity, who had risked death rather than deny who he was making me confront my own cowardice about living authentically. "Marcus," he said suddenly, his expression growing serious, "can I ask you something personal?" My heart rate increased, but I nodded. In America, is it difficult to be gay? I know it is legal, but socially, personally, is it still complicated? The question was clearly about more than academic curiosity, and I found myself at a crossroads. I could deflect, maintain the professional boundary I had always used to protect myself from getting too involved in the stories I covered. Or I could be honest, match his courage with my own truth. It depends, I said carefully. Legally, we have protections and rights that don't exist in many other countries. But socially, personally, it can still be challenging, especially for people who grew up in traditional families or work in conservative industries. Like journalism? I met his eyes and saw that he already understood more than I had explicitly shared. Sometimes, I've spent most of my career focusing on work, convincing myself that personal relationships were distractions from the important stories I needed to tell. And now, the simple question contained everything: his awareness of the connection developing between us, his own uncertainty about navigating relationships after trauma, the possibility that we might mean something to each other beyond our professional collaboration. Now I'm beginning to think that maybe the most important story is the one about learning to live authentically, about finding the courage to love and be loved despite the risks. The conversation that followed was careful and tentative, both of us aware that we were crossing into territory that could change everything between us. Li Ming talked about the fear he still carried, the way trauma had made it difficult for him to trust anyone completely. I talked about my own fears, the way I had used work to avoid confronting my sexuality and my capacity for deep emotional connection. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Li Ming said finally. The camp, the escape, everything that happened, it changed something inside me. I don't know if I remember how to let someone care about me, how to care about someone else without being terrified of losing them. I don't know if I'm ready either, I admitted. I've never felt this way about anyone before, and I'm scared of what it might mean for my objectivity, for my ability to tell these stories without being personally compromised. We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the admission that there was something real developing between us, something that demanded a response even if we weren't sure what that response should be. Maybe we don't have to have all the answers right now, Li Ming said eventually. Maybe we can just be honest with each other. Take things slowly, see what happens without putting pressure on ourselves to know exactly where this is leading. It was such a mature, thoughtful response, and I found myself falling even deeper in love with this man whose wisdom had been earned through unimaginable hardship. Over the next few weeks, our relationship evolved gradually and carefully. We continued working together on the series of articles about Chinese refugees, but we also began spending time together that wasn't related to journalism. Li Ming showed me parts of Istanbul I had never seen, small neighborhoods where refugee communities had formed, markets where vendors spoke multiple languages, restaurants that served the regional dishes he had grown up eating in China. I watched him gradually relax as he felt safer in my presence, saw glimpses of who he had been before trauma changed him. He was intellectually curious about everything, passionate about literature and poetry in ways that made me understand why he had been targeted for his dangerous ideas. His English improved rapidly, and he began sharing Chinese poetry with me, translating the verses and explaining their cultural significance. But I also saw the lingering effects of his ordeal, the way he still positioned himself near exits in restaurants, the nightmares that sometimes woke him in the early morning hours, the sudden moments of anxiety when he heard certain sounds or saw people who reminded him of his captors. It was during one of these moments, about 2 months after we first met, that I fully understood the depth of what Li Ming was dealing with. We were walking through the Grand Bazaar when he suddenly grabbed my arm and pulled me into an alcove, his face pale with fear. "What's wrong?" I asked, immediately alert to possible danger. "That man," he whispered, pointing toward a group of tourists. "The one taking pictures. He looks like one of the guards from the camp." I looked where he was pointing and saw a middle-aged Asian man with a camera, clearly just another tourist exploring the historic market. But Li Ming was shaking, his breathing rapid and shallow, lost in a flashback to his months of captivity. "Li Ming," I said gently, taking his hands in mine. "You're safe. You're in Istanbul, not in the camp. That man is just a tourist. He can't hurt you." It took several minutes for him to calm down, for his breathing to return to normal and his grip on my hands to relax. When he finally looked at me again, his eyes were filled with embarrassment and frustration. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know it's irrational. I know I'm safe here, but sometimes my body doesn't remember that." "You don't need to apologize," I said firmly. "What you survived would leave scars on anyone. The fact that you're here, that you're healing, that you're building a new life, that's incredible, not something to be ashamed of." That night, Li Ming stayed in my hotel room for the first time. Not for anything physical, we were still moving very slowly in that regard, but because he didn't want to be alone with the memories the flashback had triggered. We lay in bed talking until dawn, and he told me more about the daily reality of life in the detention facility, the psychological techniques used to break down prisoners' sense of self. They were very effective at making us doubt our own perceptions, our own worth, he said, his voice quiet in the darkness. They would tell us that our families had disowned us, that our friends had reported us to authorities, that everyone we cared about was ashamed of who we were. After months of hearing this every day, part of you starts to believe it. Do you still believe it sometimes? Sometimes, he admitted. When I have difficult days, when the depression is particularly strong, I wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe I am defective. Maybe my sexuality is a corruption. Maybe everyone would be better off if I had never existed. I turned to face him in the dim light filtering through the hotel curtains. "Li Ming, look at me." He met my eyes, and I could see the vulnerability there. The young man who had been systematically told he was worthless and disgusting until part of him believed it. "You are not defective," I said firmly. "You are not corrupted. You are not a burden or a disappointment or any of the other things they told you. You are brave and intelligent and kind, and the world is better because you're in it. Anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve to be part of your life." He started crying then, quiet tears that seemed to carry months of suppressed pain and fear. I held him while he cried, feeling the weight of everything he had endured, amazed by his strength in surviving it. "I love you," I said quietly, the words coming out before I had consciously decided to say them. He went very still in my arms, and for a moment I worried that I had moved too fast, said too much. But then he pulled back to look at me, his eyes still wet with tears but filled with something that looked like wonder. "I love you too," he whispered. "I didn't think I would ever be able to say that to anyone, but I love you too." We made love for the first time that morning, slowly and carefully, both of us aware that this was about more than physical desire. For Li Ming, it was an act of reclaiming his body and his sexuality after months of being told they were shameful and wrong. For me, it was the first time I had been completely vulnerable with another person, the first time I had allowed myself to be fully known and loved. Afterward, as we lay together in the early morning light, I felt a peace I had never experienced before. This man, who had survived systematic persecution designed to erase his identity, had chosen to love me. In doing so, he was teaching me what courage really meant. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act authentically despite fear. The next few months were the most intense of my life, but they were also complicated by practical realities. My visa was temporary, and I would eventually need to return to the United States. Li Ming's status in Turkey was precarious. He was essentially stateless, unable to return to China but without legal documentation that would allow him to travel freely or build a permanent life anywhere else. We talked about these challenges constantly, trying to figure out how to build a future together despite the obstacles. I researched asylum procedures in the United States, immigration lawyers who specialized in political persecution cases, organizations that might be able to help Li Ming establish legal status. The bureaucratic process was slow and uncertain, and we both knew that there were no guarantees. Li Ming might be denied asylum, or the process might take years, during which time we would be separated by both distance and his inability to travel. It was during one of these difficult conversations about our uncertain future that Li Ming made a decision that both surprised and impressed me. "I want to tell my full story publicly," he said. "Not just the articles you've written which protect my identity, but really publicly. Television interviews, speaking at human rights conferences, testifying before government committees. I want to put a human face on what's happening in those camps. I stared at him, understanding immediately what he was proposing and what it would cost him. Going public would make him a target, would eliminate any possibility of ever returning to China, would expose him to potential retaliation. Li Ming, if you do that, there's no going back. The Chinese government will mark you as a high-profile dissident. It could put you in more danger, not less. I know, he said calmly, but it could also help other people who are still trapped in those places. And Marcus, hiding hasn't kept me safe. Running hasn't kept me safe. Maybe it's time to stop hiding and start fighting back. The decision to go public with Li Ming's story was transformative for both of us. Within weeks of his first major television interview, he became an internationally recognized advocate for Chinese human rights, speaking at conferences around the world about his experiences and calling for stronger international pressure on the Chinese government. The attention was overwhelming but also empowering. Messages poured in from people around the world who had been moved by his story, from other survivors of persecution who felt less alone, from activists who wanted to support his work. But the most meaningful response came from other Chinese refugees, people who had been hiding in the shadows of cities around the world, afraid to speak out about their experiences. Li Ming's courage in going public gave them permission to share their own stories, to seek help, to believe that survival was possible. The international attention also helped with Li Ming's immigration case. Human rights organizations rallied around his asylum application, and prominent lawyers volunteered to represent him pro bono. After 10 months of uncertainty, he was granted political asylum in the United States, with a path to permanent residency and eventually citizenship. Standing in the airport in Istanbul, waiting for our flight to San Francisco, I looked at Li Ming and marveled at the journey that had brought us to this moment. Less than a year ago, he had been a prisoner in a Chinese detention facility, told daily that his identity was shameful and his existence threatened social order. Now he was traveling to America as a recognized human rights advocate, with legal protection and a platform to continue his work. "Are you nervous?" I asked as we boarded the plane. "Terrified," he said with a smile, "but also hopeful. For the first time since my arrest, I feel like I'm moving towards something instead of running away from something." The flight to San Francisco was long, but I spent most of it watching Li Ming sleep, still amazed that this brave, resilient man had chosen to build a life with me. He had taught me what authentic love looked like, not the safe, comfortable kind I had imagined, but the kind that requires constant courage, constant choice, constant willingness to be vulnerable. When we landed in America, we were met by representatives from several human rights organizations, journalists wanting to interview Li Ming, and activists eager to support his work. But the moment that meant the most to me was when we finally reached my apartment in San Francisco, when Li Ming set down his single suitcase and looked around at what would now be our shared home. "It's real," he said quietly. "We're really here, we're really safe, we're really together." "It's real," I confirmed, pulling him into my arms. "And we're going to build something beautiful here." The first year of our life together in San Francisco was a whirlwind of adjustment and advocacy. Li Ming threw himself into human rights work with the same determination that had enabled his escape from detention. He testified before Congress about conditions in Chinese re-education facilities, spoke at universities about the persecution of minorities and dissidents, and worked with organizations helping other refugees navigate the asylum process. I continued my journalism career but increasingly focused on stories related to human rights and refugee issues. Li Ming's perspective had given me insights into these topics that I could never have gained through traditional reporting, and my writing became more personal, more connected to the human realities behind political abstractions. But beyond our professional work, we were learning how to be a couple, how to build a domestic life together after everything we had both been through. Li Ming was still dealing with trauma nightmares, anxiety, moments of depression when the weight of everything he had lost seemed overwhelming. I was learning how to be a supportive partner while also maintaining my own emotional equilibrium. We went to therapy, both individually and together, working through the complicated feelings that came with building a relationship under such extraordinary circumstances. Li Ming worked on healing from his ordeal and learning to trust that safety and love could be permanent. I worked on understanding why I had avoided emotional intimacy for so long and how to be vulnerable without losing myself. It was during one of our therapy sessions, about 18 months after Li Ming's arrival in America, that he brought up something that had been weighing on him. "I want to try to contact my family," he said. "I know it's dangerous for them, and I know they might not want to hear from me, but I need to try." The decision to reach out to his family in China was agonizing. We spent weeks researching the safest ways to make contact, consulting with security experts about protecting his family members from retaliation. Eventually, we arranged for a message to be delivered through intermediaries, letting his parents know that he was alive and safe. The response, when it finally came months later, was heartbreaking in its complexity. His mother sent a brief message expressing relief that he was alive, but also making it clear that ongoing contact would be too dangerous for everyone involved. His father, according to the intermediary, had been questioned by authorities about Li Ming's activities and had been forced to publicly disown his son to protect the rest of the family. "They love me," Li Ming said after receiving this news, "but they can't afford to show it. That's what authoritarian systems do. They force people to choose between love and survival usually wins." I watched him process this loss, this final severing of ties with his homeland and his birth family, and I was amazed by his resilience. Instead of being destroyed by the rejection, he channeled his pain into his advocacy work, speaking even more passionately about the human cost of political persecution. "Family isn't just about blood," he told me one evening as we walked along the San Francisco waterfront. "It's about the people who choose to love you, who support you, who stand by you when things get difficult. You're my family now, Marcus. You and the community we've built here, the other survivors we work with, the people who believe in what we're fighting for." 3 years after Li Ming's arrival in America, we decided to get married. It wasn't a decision we made lightly. Both of us were aware that marriage wouldn't solve the trauma or the ongoing challenges of building a life together after everything we had been through. But it felt like an important symbol of our commitment to each other and to the future we were creating together. The wedding was small and intimate, held in Golden Gate Park with a handful of close friends and colleagues. Li Ming's chosen family included other Chinese refugees he had mentored, activists he had worked with, and the therapist who had helped him heal from his trauma. My family included my parents and siblings, who had flown in from various parts of the country, and who had embraced Li Ming with a warmth that made me understand how fortunate I was to have been born into acceptance rather than having to fight for it. The ceremony itself was conducted in both English and Mandarin, acknowledging both of our backgrounds and the cultural synthesis we were creating together. We wrote our own vows, promising not just to love each other but to continue fighting for the values that had brought us together: truth, justice, and the right of all people to live authentically. "Li Ming," I said during my vows, "you taught me what courage really means, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act with integrity despite fear. You showed me that love isn't just about happiness and comfort, but about choosing each other every day, especially when that choice is difficult. I promise to continue learning from your example, to support your work and your healing, and to build with you a life that honors everything you've survived and everything we hope to achieve together." Li Ming's vows were characteristically thoughtful and precise. "Marcus, when I was in detention, I thought my life was over. I thought that even if I survived physically, the person I really was had been destroyed forever. You helped me discover that identity isn't something that can be taken away by others. It's something you choose to claim every day, through your actions and your relationships. You chose to love me when I wasn't sure I was worthy of love. Now I choose to build a life with you that proves that freedom and love are not just political concepts, but daily practices that require constant courage and commitment." As we exchanged rings and kissed for the first time as married partners, I felt the presence of everyone who couldn't be there: Li Ming's family in China, the people still trapped in detention facilities, the countless individuals around the world who were still fighting for the right to love and be loved authentically. Our marriage marked the beginning of a new chapter in our advocacy work and our personal relationship. As a married couple, we became more visible in human rights circles, speaking together at conferences and events, telling our story as an example of love surviving persecution. But more importantly, we were learning the ordinary pleasures and challenges of married life: the daily negotiations, the shared responsibilities, the deep satisfaction of building something together that was larger than either of us individually. Li Ming discovered a talent for cooking, recreating dishes from his childhood and experimenting with fusion cuisine that reflected our multicultural household. I learned to appreciate the subtle beauty of Chinese literature and philosophy, which Li Ming shared with me through translations and explanations that helped me understand the depth of culture and history he had been forced to leave behind. We traveled when we could, always conscious of Li Ming's status as a high-profile dissident but determined not to let fear completely constrain our lives. We visited other cities with large Chinese refugee communities, supporting local organizations and building networks of mutual aid. We attended human rights conferences in Europe and Canada, sharing our story and learning from other activists facing similar challenges. Each trip reinforced my understanding of how precious and rare our love was, how many obstacles we had overcome to be together, how many people around the world were still fighting for basic human dignity. It also reinforced my gratitude for the life we had built together, not perfect, not without ongoing challenges, but real and honest and full of purpose. Now, 7 years after we first met in that community center in Istanbul, I watched Li Ming prepare for another speaking engagement, another opportunity to tell his story and advocate for people who are still trapped in situations like the one he escaped. He has become a powerful speaker, able to convey both the horror of systematic persecution and the hope that resistance and survival represent. But the Li Ming I love most isn't the public advocate or the human rights icon. It's the man who wakes up early to make tea using leaves his mother used to prepare, maintaining that connection to his homeland even when all other ties have been severed. It's the person who still sometimes has nightmares but who has learned to find comfort in my presence, who trusts me enough to be vulnerable about his fears and his dreams. It's the partner who challenges me to be more courageous in my own life and work, who reminds me daily that authenticity is not a destination but a practice that requires constant commitment. We still face challenges. Li Ming's trauma doesn't disappear just because he's safe and loved now, and we both have to work constantly to maintain our mental health and our relationship. The advocacy work we do is emotionally demanding, requiring us to constantly confront stories of persecution and injustice that can be overwhelming. But we also have something that many couples never experience: the knowledge that our love was forged in the crucible of real adversity, that we chose each other not just in moments of happiness, but in moments of genuine danger and uncertainty. We know that our relationship isn't just about personal fulfillment but about something larger, a commitment to values and principles that matter beyond our individual lives. Every morning when I wake up next to Li Ming, every evening when we sit together talking about our days, every moment when we laugh together or comfort each other or simply exist in comfortable silence, I'm reminded of the extraordinary nature of ordinary love made possible by courage. And I know that Li Ming, this man who refused to let an authoritarian system destroy his identity, who risked everything for the possibility of freedom, who chose to love me despite every reason to guard his heart, has given me the greatest gift imaginable: the chance to live authentically, to love without reservation, and to be part of something larger than ourselves. In a world that often seems designed to crush individual spirit and authentic connection, we have built something that stands as proof that love, real love, can survive anything and create meaning even in the darkest circumstances. And that knowledge gives me hope not just for our future together, but for the possibility that everyone, everywhere, might someday have the freedom to love and be loved as their truest, most authentic selves. But life, as we would learn, had more tests waiting for us. Just when we thought we had found our rhythm, our purpose, and our peace, the world reminded us that love built from survival must constantly prove its resilience against new challenges. It was during our 8th year together that we faced a crisis that would test not just our relationship, but everything we had built our new life upon. The call came on a winter morning in December, while Li Ming was in his study working on his memoir, a book that had taken him 3 years to write as he processed his experiences and found the words to describe indescribable trauma. I was in the kitchen making our usual morning coffee when I heard him cry out, a sound of pure anguish that made me drop my mug and run to him. He was staring at his laptop screen, his face pale with shock, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of his desk. On the screen was a news article in Chinese, accompanied by photographs that I couldn't understand but which clearly contained devastating information. "What is it?" I asked, immediately moving to his side. "My brother," he whispered, his voice barely audible. My younger brother Chen Wei. He's been arrested. My heart sank as the implications hit me. Li Ming's family had maintained their distance from him precisely to avoid this kind of retaliation. His public advocacy work, his high-profile status as a human rights activist, had made him a target, and now it seemed the Chinese government was using his family members to send a message. What are the charges? I asked, though I already feared the answer. Li Ming scrolled through the article, his hands shaking as he translated. Conspiracy to spread harmful information about the state. Maintaining contact with foreign hostile forces. Endangering national security. He looked up at me with eyes full of grief and guilt. They're using the same charges they used against me, Marcus. They're saying he's been in contact with me, that he's been helping me spread anti-China propaganda. Has he been in contact with you? No, Li Ming said firmly. We haven't spoken since I left China 8 years ago. He was still in high school then, just 16 years old. The last time I saw him, he was worried about his college entrance exams, not politics. I studied the article over Li Ming's shoulder, using translation software to understand the details. The charges were serious, the kind that could result in decades in prison or worse. But what made the situation even more heartbreaking was the clear implication that Chen Wei was being used as leverage, a way to pressure Li Ming to stop his advocacy work. This is because of me? Li Ming said, his voice breaking. Because I chose to speak out, because I refused to disappear quietly. Now my baby brother is paying the price for my choices. I knelt beside his chair and took his hands in mine. They were ice cold and trembling with emotion. Li Ming, this is not your fault. This is what authoritarian governments do. They target families to silence dissidents. You are not responsible for their cruelty. But I am responsible, he insisted. I knew this could happen. I knew that by going public, by becoming visible, I was putting my family at risk. I chose my principles over their safety, and now Chen Wei is in one of those camps because of me. The guilt in his voice was devastating to hear. For 8 years, Li Ming had built his new life on the foundation of his escape and his commitment to advocacy. He had convinced himself that the sacrifice of his family relationships was worth it if his work could help other people avoid the persecution he had experienced. Now that calculation was being tested in the most brutal way possible. Over the next few days, we tried to gather more information about Chen Wei's situation. Li Ming reached out to human rights organizations, journalists with contacts in China, and other activists who might have insights into his brother's case. The picture that emerged was grim. Chen Wei had been arrested during a coordinated sweep targeting the families of known dissidents. Several other relatives of prominent activists had been detained on similar charges. Suggesting this was a systematic campaign designed to pressure overseas dissidents to abandon their work. It's a message, explained Dr. Sarah Kim, a China expert at Stanford who had been following Li Ming's case for years. We were sitting in her office, surrounded by books and papers about Chinese politics and human rights. The government is essentially saying to dissidents abroad, your advocacy comes at a cost to the people you love. Is it worth it? Li Ming sat quietly through this explanation, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. I could see him processing not just the political implications but the deeply personal anguish of knowing his brother was suffering because of choices Li Ming had made. What can we do? I asked. Are there diplomatic channels, international pressure that might help? Dr. Kim's expression was sympathetic but realistic. The Chinese government doesn't typically respond to international pressure in cases like this. If anything, publicity might make things worse for Chen Wei. They're counting on Li Ming's love for his brother to silence him. That evening, Li Ming and I sat in our living room, surrounded by the life we had built together, grappling with an impossible decision. Continue the advocacy work that had become our life's mission, knowing it might cost Chen Wei his freedom or his life. Or find a way to step back, to disappear from public view, in hopes that it might help his brother? I can't ask you to give up everything we've built, Li Ming said quietly. Your career, our work, the foundation we've established. It's not fair to destroy all of that because of my family situation. Our work, our foundation, I corrected. And Li Ming, we're talking about your brother's life. If there's even a chance that stepping back might help him, we have to consider it. But what about all the other people who are still trapped? What about the refugees we're helping, the awareness we're raising, the policy changes we've been working toward? If I disappear, if I stop speaking out, doesn't that mean the government wins? Doesn't that make everything we've done meaningless? It was the central dilemma of human rights advocacy, the tension between individual cases and broader principles, between personal loyalty and public responsibility. Li Ming was being forced to choose between his brother's immediate safety and his commitment to a cause that could potentially help thousands of other people in similar situations. We spent weeks consulting with lawyers, human rights experts, and other activists who had faced similar dilemmas. The advice was varied and often contradictory. Some urged Li Ming to maintain his public profile, arguing that backing down would only encourage more family-targeted persecution. Others suggested that a strategic retreat might be the only way to save Chen Wei. The decision became even more complicated when we received an unexpected contact. A man claiming to be a Chinese government intermediary reached out through encrypted channels, offering a deal. Li Ming could stop all public advocacy, cease his media appearances, and discontinue his work with human rights organizations. In exchange, Chen Wei would be released and allowed to leave China with his family. It could be legitimate, said James Morrison, a former State Department official who now worked with human rights organizations. We were meeting in a secure location, discussing the implications of the offer. The Chinese government has made similar deals before, trading the freedom of detained family members for the silence of overseas dissidents. Or it could be a trap, I pointed out, a way to neutralize Li Ming's advocacy while providing no real guarantee about his brother's safety. Li Ming listened to these discussions with growing anguish. The uncertainty was torture, not knowing whether his brother was being tortured, not knowing whether this offer was genuine, not knowing whether his continued advocacy was helping or hurting the person he was trying to protect. I need to see him, Li Ming said suddenly during one of our strategy meetings. I need to know that Chen Wei is really alive, really safe, before I make any decisions about stepping back from advocacy. The room fell silent. Everyone understood what he was suggesting and why it was impossible. Li Ming, said Dr. Kim gently, you know you can't return to China. It would be suicide. They would arrest you the moment you stepped off the plane. Then maybe that's what I should do, Li Ming said quietly. Maybe I should trade myself for him. I'm the one they really want. Chen Wei is innocent. He was just a child when I left China. If I surrender myself, maybe they'll let him go. The suggestion horrified me. Li Ming, that's not sacrifice, that's martyrdom. And it wouldn't necessarily save Chen Wei. They could arrest you and keep him imprisoned anyway. But at least I would know I tried everything, he said. At least I wouldn't have to live with the knowledge that my brother is suffering because of my choices. That night, I found Li Ming sitting in our garden, staring up at the stars. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of impossible decisions and unbearable guilt. I don't know how to live with this, he said when I sat beside him. Every day that I continue my advocacy work, every interview I give, every speech I make, I wonder if it's making things worse for Chen Wei. But if I stop, if I disappear, what message does that send to other people who are still trapped? What does it say about the value of resistance? I took his hand in mine, feeling the familiar calluses on his fingers from his hours of writing, the hands that had held me through my own moments of doubt and fear. Maybe the question isn't whether to continue or stop, I said carefully. Maybe the question is how to continue in a way that honors both your commitment to the cause and your love for your brother. Over the following weeks, we developed a new approach to Li Ming's advocacy work. Instead of high-profile media appearances and public speeches, he began focusing on behind-the-scenes work, consulting with policymakers, advising other activists, writing analysis that could be published without his byline. He maintained his commitment to human rights advocacy but reduced his public visibility. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely but felt like the best available option under impossible circumstances. Li Ming could continue contributing to the cause he believed in while reducing the immediate provocation that his public profile represented. The strategy seemed to be working. After 6 months of Li Ming's reduced public presence, we began receiving reports that Chun Wei's conditions had improved somewhat. He had been moved from a high-security facility to a lower-security detention center, and family members were occasionally allowed to visit him. "It's not freedom," Li Ming said when we received this news, "but it's something. Maybe it means he's not being actively tortured anymore." The partial improvement in Chun Wei's situation allowed Li Ming to focus more on his writing. The memoir he had been working on became not just a personal account of survival but a meditation on the broader questions of resistance, sacrifice, and moral responsibility that our situation had forced us to confront. The book, when it was eventually published, became an international bestseller. Li Ming wrote under a pseudonym to maintain the low profile that seemed to be helping his brother. But the power of his story and his analysis of authoritarian persecution resonated with readers around the world. More importantly, the success of the book allowed us to establish a foundation that could continue human rights work even if Li Ming remained out of the public eye. We used the proceeds to fund legal assistance for other Chinese refugees, mental health services for trauma survivors, and research into the most effective ways to pressure authoritarian governments without endangering the families of activists. "I think I'm learning that there are many ways to fight," Li Ming told me as we celebrated the book's success. "Public resistance is one way, but so is quiet persistence. So is creating resources for other people. So is refusing to let them break your spirit even when they force you to change your tactics." But the most significant development in our lives during this period wasn't professional, it was personal. After years of focusing intensely on survival, advocacy, and crisis management, we began talking seriously about expanding our family. "I want to adopt a child," Li Ming said one evening as we were walking through Golden Gate Park. "I want to give some young person the kind of safety and love that Chin Wei and I never had, the kind of acceptance that allows someone to grow up knowing they're valued for who they are." The idea had been growing in both our minds for months. Our work with refugees had brought us into contact with many young people who had been separated from their families, who needed stable homes where they could heal from trauma and build new identities. The adoption process was complex, requiring extensive background checks, home studies, and interviews. Our high-profile status as activists initially made some agencies nervous, but we eventually found an organization that specialized in placing children with families involved in human rights work. Our son, David, came to us when he was 8 years old. He had been born in Myanmar but had fled with his family during the political crackdowns there. His parents had died during their journey to safety, and he had spent 2 years in refugee camps before being resettled in the United States. David spoke limited English when he first came to live with us, but he was remarkably resilient and adaptable. Li Ming worked with him on language skills while I helped him navigate the American school system. Both of us were amazed by his intelligence and his capacity for joy despite everything he had been through. "He reminds me of myself at that age," Li Ming said one evening as we watched David practice piano, an instrument he had discovered at school and shown remarkable talent for. That determination to find beauty and meaning even when the world seems chaotic and dangerous. Becoming parents transformed our relationship in ways we hadn't anticipated. Li Ming, who had always been intensely focused and driven, discovered a capacity for playfulness and wonder that watching David develop brought out in him. I found myself thinking about the future in new ways, imagining the world we wanted to create for our son. "He's going to grow up knowing that families come in many forms," Li Ming said one evening as we helped David with his homework. "He'll never have to wonder if there's something wrong with having two fathers who love each other and love him. And he'll grow up understanding that freedom isn't something you can take for granted." I added, "That there are people all over the world still fighting for basic human dignity." David's presence in our lives also brought new perspective to our ongoing concern about Chen Wei. Li Ming began to understand that family responsibility wasn't just about protecting relatives who shared his blood, but about creating safety and opportunity for the children who needed it most. "I can't save Chen Wei by destroying myself," Li Ming said during one of our family dinners, watching David excitedly tell us about a science project he was working on. "But I can honor what Chen Wei would want for me by building a life that includes love, creativity, and service to others." The breakthrough in Chen Wei's case came unexpectedly. During our second year as David's parents, Li Ming received a call from one of his contacts in the human rights community. Chun Wei had been released as part of a broader amnesty program for prisoners who had not been convicted of violent crimes. "He's alive," Li Ming said, tears streaming down his face as he relayed the information. "He's free, and he's alive." The joy was overwhelming but complicated. Chun Wei was free, but he was also being closely monitored by Chinese authorities. Any contact with Li Ming would put him at risk of rearrest. His freedom came with the implicit understanding that he would maintain complete separation from his activist brother. "I may never see him again," Li Ming said as we processed this news together. "But he's alive, he's free, and he has a chance to build a life. That's more than I dared hope for during the worst months of his detention." The resolution of Chun Wei's case allowed Li Ming to gradually increase his public advocacy again, though he remained more strategic and careful about his approach. He began writing opinion pieces for major newspapers, participating in academic conferences, and consulting with policymakers about human rights issues. But perhaps more importantly, it allowed him to fully embrace his role as David's father without the constant worry about whether his public work was endangering family members. "I want David to see that you can fight for justice without being consumed by anger," Li Ming told me as we prepared for David's 10th birthday party. "I want him to understand that the goal isn't to defeat your enemies, but to create a world where there are fewer enemies, where more people have the opportunity to live with dignity." David was thriving in ways that amazed both of us. He excelled academically, made friends easily, and showed a natural empathy that drew other children to him. He was also developing a sophisticated understanding of the world's complexities, asking thoughtful questions about politics, human rights, and the experiences that had shaped his father's lives. "Why did the Chinese government hurt your brother?" he asked Li Ming one evening as they worked together on a model airplane. Li Ming considered his answer carefully. "Because they were afraid," he said finally. "Afraid that if people knew the truth about what was happening, they would demand change. Fear makes people do cruel things sometimes. But you're not afraid to tell the truth," David observed.
"I'm afraid," Li Ming corrected gently.
"But I've learned that being afraid doesn't mean you can't still do the right thing. Sometimes doing the right thing requires being afraid and doing it anyway." These conversations with David became some of Li Ming's favorite moments. Opportunities to share wisdom gained through suffering while nurturing a young person who would hopefully never face such extreme choices. As David entered his teenage years, he began expressing interest in his father's work. He started a human rights club at his school, organized fundraisers for refugee assistance organizations, and wrote thoughtful essays about global justice issues. "I want to help people the way you and Dad Marcus help people," he told us during a family meeting about his future educational plans. "But I want to do it through medicine. I want to be a doctor who works with refugees and trauma survivors." Li Ming and I exchanged a look of pride and amazement. Our son, who had experienced displacement and loss himself, was choosing to dedicate his life to healing others who had faced similar challenges. "You don't have to follow in our footsteps," I told him. "You can choose any path that makes you happy." "But this is what makes me happy," David replied. "Helping people, making things better, using whatever privileges and opportunities one have to serve others who haven't been as lucky." Looking at our son, this remarkable young man who had survived trauma, adapted to a new culture, and was now choosing to dedicate his life to service, I understood that Li Ming and I had succeeded in creating something more valuable than any policy change or media attention our advocacy work had achieved. We had raised a person who embodied the values we fought for, who would carry those values into the next generation. "Sometimes I think about Chun Wei," Li Ming said one evening as we sat together on our porch, watching David practice piano through the living room window. "I wonder what his life is like now, whether he's happy, whether he thinks about me sometimes." "I'm sure he does," I said, "and I'm sure he would be proud of the life you've built, the family you've created, the young man you're raising." "I hope so," Li Ming said quietly. "I hope he knows that even though we can't be brothers in the traditional sense anymore, everything I do is still partly for him. The life I live, the love I share, the child I'm raising, it's all proof that his sacrifice wasn't meaningless." Now, 15 years after we first met in that community center in Istanbul, I watch Li Ming help David prepare for his college interviews, coaching him on how to talk about his experiences and aspirations. David is 17 now, fluent in 4 languages, passionate about human rights and medicine, and accepted to several prestigious universities. Li Ming has become a respected voice in human rights circles, someone who combines deep personal experience with sophisticated analysis of political and social issues. His writing has influenced policy discussions around the world, and his quiet advocacy has helped dozens of other refugees build new lives in safety. But the Li Ming I love most is still the one I see in our daily life together. The man who makes tea every morning using leaves that remind him of his homeland, who reads poetry aloud in languages David is learning, who still sometimes wakes from nightmares but who has learned to find comfort in the family we've created together. Do you ever regret it? I asked him recently as we celebrated our 15th anniversary. The choices you made, the life you built, the prices you paid for freedom? He considered the question seriously, looking around our home at the photographs of our life together, the evidence of love and commitment that filled every room. I regret that the world forced me to make such difficult choices, he said finally. I regret that Chun Wei paid a price for my decisions. I regret that there are still people trapped in situations like the one I escaped from. But I don't regret choosing authenticity over safety, love over comfort, purpose over ease. He took my hand in his, fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing after all these years together. And I especially don't regret falling in love with an American journalist who taught me that courage isn't something you have to face alone, that building a life worth living is something you can do together, one day at a time. As I write this, David is preparing to leave for college, where he'll study pre-medicine with a focus on refugee health. Li Ming is working on his second book, a guide for other activists navigating the balance between public advocacy and personal safety. I'm completing a documentary about families separated by political persecution, a project inspired by our own experience but extending far beyond it. We are still the men who met in Istanbul 15 years ago, one fleeing persecution, one seeking truth, but we are also something more now. We are partners who have weathered impossible choices together, parents who have raised a child to embody the values we fought for, advocates who have learned that the most important resistance sometimes happens in the quiet spaces between public action. Every morning when I wake up next to Li Ming, every evening when we sit around the dinner table with David discussing his dreams and our hopes for his future, every moment when we laugh together or comfort each other or simply exist in the companionable silence of deep understanding, I'm reminded that love isn't just something that survives adversity. It's something that transforms adversity into meaning. And in a world that still struggles with accepting difference, that still punishes people for living authentically, that still tears families apart in the name of political control, our little family stands as proof that love really can triumph over everything, not through perfect victories, but through the daily choice to keep building, keep believing, and keep creating space for hope to flourish even in the midst of an imperfect world.